we're back. We are coming to the final stretches. Thank you all for coming back and hanging in with us. We've got one more panel for you before our keynote closer. This panel is hosted by me, so that makes it easy. What I'd like you to do is put your hands together, welcome my panelists that we've got coming out. We've got Vaughn, Dmitry, Helen, and Manis. All right, thank you guys for, careful. Thank you for joining us. And thank you for taking your time out to be on this panel today. If we could, let's just start. Dmitry, if you could give us a brief introduction.
Hi everyone, I'm Dmitry Raidman. I'm the CTO and co-founder of a company called Cybeats. We are building solutions for SBOM management and supply chain intelligence. Happy to be here with you.
Vaughn?
I'm Vaughn Hazen. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at CNRail.
Helen?
Hi, I'm lead architect for implementing securing supply chain at SAP.
Fantastic.
Thanks.
And Manis?
Hi, my name is Giri. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer for WestJet.
Great. So today we're going to be talking about the supply chain. Supply chain attacks are on the rise, and we got to figure out what we're going to be doing about it. So first question. There was a time when SaaS vendors provided better security simply because they were focused on what they did. There was no compromise between their security and the internal security you would do in, say, a corporate data center where you're sharing services. First off, do you feel this has changed, and where on your internal risk register are you placing these third-party vendors and their security? Vaughn, let's start with you.
Well, I think things have changed, and the reason they've changed is because we've become aware of the way that modern software development works, and they're using modules, reusing modules, they're being used broadly, and you don't always know what's in them. You know, what's building up these components of code, and where are they coming from? You know, are they clean? What are the situations there? I know that there's work that's being done with SBOMs and all that stuff, but even the SaaS solutions are leveraging this code. They could be potentially vulnerable, and we don't know what's in there. So yeah, I think things have changed a little.
Fantastic. Manis, how is it at WestJet?
Yeah, so a couple things, right? From a SaaS standpoint, it was probably wrong to think that they would do security better because it was always a shared security model. They would be responsible for the application, operating system, infrastructure part, while the consumers of their software would still be responsible for what I would say the data of it, right? So the significance of evaluating their security hasn't really changed. And what has only taken I would say, a little bit of a paradigm shift is how much do we want to at least rely on their own controls versus how much do we need to verify. And so that's the only dimensional change that I would think that we are taking on.
Gotcha. Yeah, absolutely. Helen, tell us, SAP, big move into the cloud over the last decade.
Definitely, there is more risk. We know that today, 70% of any given application, more or less, contains open source and third-party components, and it expands the attack surface. And based on the attacks, we know that adversary only taken more advantage of outdated libraries and open source libraries that could introduce different attack vectors into our systems. So every organization has to put more emphasis on how they're securing their software, and not just software, but the whole infrastructure.
Yeah, for sure, absolutely. Dmitry, as a vendor, like software vendor, where are you sitting?
Definitely, I'll actually address this question not from software vendor perspective. I think there's other questions I can answer better, but about this one is, I think that the pandemic made really a tectonic shift in people going and working from home, and the companies being less relying on their perimeter, right? I mean, perimeter does not exist anymore. It's everywhere. It's extended to everyone, BYOD device or whatsoever. And really, we can even see the cybersecurity solutions and SaaS solutions such as ZTNAs, security gateways, EDR, XDR systems are transitioning to be in the cloud. And we really see that companies prefer to let SaaS providers who do something very well to take the ownership of this process of their company. Things like cybersecurity protection, as I said. Also, companies more open to give away their data to the cloud because they know that this data need to be accessed from anywhere at any time. So this is definitely makes very big digital transformation in all of the industries, and that's of course increasing the risk, right? Because everyone rushed to make this digital transformation, but now people start realizing how much risk it imposes due to this shift.
Oh, absolutely. One of the things we did see during the pandemic was this massive, quick shift, right? It was Friday, everybody said, work from home, 100%, everybody. And they used corporate policies to implement that type of behavior, even in the software vendors as well. So everybody's working from home, everybody's working from a hostile network. The companies that use hybrid models more and more, so we're seeing this mix of the pure outsourced SaaS with on-prem style private cloud. Software developers have been including those third-party libraries, in absolutely everything. And who here has not heard of Log4j? Excellent. All right, because that thing was in everything, and when it hit, everybody was looking. Every vendor, every ops, every CEO was calling, saying, "Am I vulnerable?" So, did that become the tipping point for a software bill of materials to become mandatory, the SBOMs? Dmitry, as probably the expert on SBOMs, where do you sit?
Yeah, this and many others, right? I mean, Log4j wasn't the first thing that happened, right? We have seen CC Cleaner, like 3-4 years ago happening, right? Affecting multiple ASUS built computers. We have seen the SolarWinds, right? Was a great example. 18,000 companies across private sector, public sector were affected or not knowing, right? People became aware, there is like a software supply chain attack on SolarWinds. Am I affected? Am I not affected? Am I even have something from SolarWinds, right? This is the question that we're running in people's mind. And then we have seen like Log4j, we have seen, Codecov, which is another great example, Kaseya. I mean, there's plenty of them. It's not like one-time thing, right? But really what gave a really big boost for the SBOM topic is the executive order 14028, which actually mentioned this SBOM letters 11 times, right, when published in 2021. And this was really fueled by the SolarWinds, the Log4j, and the Colonial Pipeline attack. That's what kind of motivated the US government administration to publish that note.
Yeah, and when the US government starts to push down something, it tends to follow up into Canada as well. So WestJet, is this something that WestJet feels is, a mandatory thing that you would want from your vendors to have that SBOM so you've got the details?
So there's two aspects to it, right? And so as Dmitry was mentioning, the tipping point was probably some years back. SolarWinds comes to mind for us and all. But really what Log4j was a wake-up call because security vendors were impacted. Those software which we rely on to tell whether there's vulnerable parts into our network, bad traffic is coming and all that, were themselves down with the same exact component, and we didn't actually know, are we able to detect, are we going to know when we can find this out, and when are these going to all get fixed? And so at that point in time, it really became evident that this is something that needs to be looked at more seriously, and it's not something to be put off for long. Now, Gartner obviously gives stats that by 2025 this will become a big thing. But the difference is regulated versus non-regulated. You mentioned US. There's no such regulation in all other jurisdictions. So is it the risk that you would use as a trigger? And I would say particularly Log4j was telling exactly that.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. So if SBOMs are the answer to the components and transparency that the vendors, with our vendors, what should we be doing about the processes with vendors? So ISO certification is a point in time. SOC 2 is a over a period of time, but both of them are retrospective. So they're both looking back on what's happened previously. Do you see a need for like a constant view of your vendors, procedures, sort of like a live SOC 2 view? Helen, let's start with you on that.
I don't think we are still at the moment when SOC and ISO can actually demand how this is going to look like in terms of certification, but I'm pretty sure we're going to get there soon, and not just across US and US-based certifications, but also EU and China, right? We have to consider that there are also regulations that are going to come out and demand certain certifications. But you mentioned the importance of SBOM in this. Yeah, what role it's going to play? SBOM itself, it's a snapshot in one time, right? It's nothing new that we had, but it's a snapshot in one time. And in order to have continuous transparency, and this is what organizations realized with Log4j, like supply chain is nothing new, attack on supply chain, but with Log4j, many organizations realized there is transparency and the ability to react fast. That's what many have been missing. They don't know what they have today, or a year from now, or a year before, right? Mm-hmm. And SBOMs provide the enablement for that transparency. But you have to look at overall solution, not just the technical snapshot that can be generated on a regular basis. You have to look at your development processes, right? How they automate it, how automation, and of course, how you will enable that transparency by pooling all the data and providing those alerts and monitoring capabilities.
Yeah, so almost like an automated SBOM included that gives you real time compared against possibly CVEs that are being released. So you can start to see those comparisons of, here's what it is, here's what was built 20 minutes ago because we put it into production, and here's the vulnerabilities out there. So with that then, Dmitry, what do we got? Is this something on the software side that you guys maybe develop, or you're seeing anybody going down that path?
Yeah, definitely. I think that most of my, job time, that's what I'm kind of doing and dealing with. How you really operationalizing SBOMs, how you getting the value out of getting these SBOMs, right? Because having SBOMs, yeah, you have a bunch of files in some folder, and they're what you do, what's next, what you're going to do with them. And one of the powerful things is that, right, if you're looking at SBOMs, they are built for, first, they provide value for the software producers, right? So if I'm producing software, I want to know how good I am, right? What kind of issues, what kind of risks I have in the software I sell and ship to my customers, right? And it's not only point in time when I'm building it, right? Today we're mostly using SCA tools, and they are point in time. They will let us, hey, today you have two, low vulnerabilities. Okay, that's great. It not supposed to stop me from shipping this software, but what happens like three months down the road? What happens 1 year down the road when this software is out there deployed? You need to continuously monitor that specific build, that specific release of the software that you analyze. You need to continue monitoring it. And if something new, and risks can be many things, right? Risk can be a vulnerability, which is very, very simple type of risk, right? It might be some software supply chain issue. It might be like one of your vendors that providing you a software went out of business, experienced a ransomware attack. Right, we have seen this with LastPass recently, right? And that was a great example. We need to start gearing up to, okay, what's happening next after this attack? Because we are using some software from this vendor. We need to know where this software is used, in what products of ours. We need to know who are the customers of us that affected. And this is only on the software producer side, right? On the software consumers, it's a whole different story. Because now I'm buying different things. I'm buying software, I'm buying devices, PLCs, routers, cameras, whatsoever, from multiple vendors. I want to take my own fate in my own hands. I want to get these SBOMs. I want to monitor. I want to know who has like old version of OpenSSL. I want to know which product uses outdated operating system that is not supported anymore, right? Like Windows 7. I want to know where is Log4j and which server running them. So it's very important for this transparency and visibility, and that's how we can use these SBOMs. And to the second part of your question is, like where we see the regulation. The regulation is here, right? I mean, FDA already released a note, and it's approved by the Congress to start demanding SBOMs in every submission of a medical device, right? Any government agency today or public sector in US will start asking for SBOMs and be looking how to deal with that, right? In Japan, we see a lot of traction with their cert. In Europe, we see the NISA bringing this regulation. So it's definitely there. It's gonna hit very soon. Probably in the next year or 2 years, it will start becoming more mandatory in more sectors like enterprise, right? Not just in medical and healthcare and industrial control and operational technologies.
Interesting then. So Vaughn, to you over at CN, because you guys consume software, you actually produce some software there as well, if I understand correctly. How is it you're going, are you going to do something? Is this something that's on your roadmap?
Well, I mean, look, when we had that situation with Log4j, one of the things that became very clear is that most of the vendors had no idea what was in their software. You know, you went out and said, hey, am I impacted by this solution? And it took them weeks to get back because they had no idea. You know, so clearly they didn't even have the SBOMs for what they put out. You know, we need to have greater transparency on that. And if you're like most of the industries I've been involved with, there's niche software that's developed specifically for that industry, probably out of somebody's garage, maybe 3 or 4 people in the entire company. They're not going through and checking the licensing for what they're using for open source. They're not validating the security of the repositories. They're not doing a lot of these things. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done just in the basics of getting that stuff clean. And to be clear, some of this stuff is being used in critical infrastructure for North America for nuclear energy. You know, you've got components that are building up some of the critical software used across the industry that are made in China, made in Russia, you know, and that is a potential backdoor into critical infrastructure in North America. We need to wake up and you know, prepare ourselves for what goes into this stuff and how do we track it and really understand and control the risk that's coming from it.
That's interesting, especially when you start talking about things like SCADA systems and critical infrastructure, not just ones that have vulnerabilities, but truly understanding how is this component made. And then you will get into intellectual property rights, you know, some of the copyright issues that people won't want to divulge the secret sauce of how they built something. So that's an interesting one because that transparency, we've seen transparency in the supply chain through things like GDPR, CCPA, PIPEDA, you know, through the privacy side of things. But on the component, the inventory side, and I've always been a proponent that says you can't do security unless you do inventory first. And that means data, that means not just knowing that the piece of software runs, but what builds that piece of software. How do you see, Manis, we'll start with you, how do you see sort of that full transparency in the supply chain? Because WestJet must have tons and tons of suppliers, and you're keeping planes in the air, so it's critical to you.
Yeah, even so more in the aviation space, because I think the supply ecosystem for aviation and airlines is probably one of the most complex. Fragmented ownership, you have span of control in certain cases, you don't. And so ultimately, if you do not have a good sense of your inventory and what you're going to do, you could land up with components in your software which have been abandoned. Like you don't know who owns what component, which licenses are valid, which ones have the correct versions on it, and like before you know, you have a 27 million lines and you don't know which components you can really maintain and manage, and that's when it starts becoming really complicated. So it is very critical to know what the inventory looks like, where all updates are needed, because nowadays, like in many cases, bad actors are targeting these software creators. Yep. And they would plant, let's say, malware or bad stuff into them, escape out without detection. They were not the target. The target is the consumers of that software, and then they can like start taking advantage of the vulnerability.
Yeah,
so
surely.
This is getting deep-rooted.
Yeah, SolarWinds proved the long game, right? And when you deal the difference between sort of the ransomware guys that are looking for money and nation state who do not care about money, they are playing the long game for disruption, ideological, whatever it is. They will go after a software developer early stage and plant the hooks so that they can come back years later if they want to and actually be able to start executing once that software developer has popped and become super famous or super popular and they're spread everywhere. So, you know, Vaughn, back to you on this. So in that transparency, is there some guideline that you see around how you build transparency into those components from your vendors?
So I think you have to look, and I know somebody said earlier they hate to use the term holistically, but you need to look at this holistically. What are we looking at from those providers? When you look at SolarWinds, part of the issue was they had a weak cyber program in general. They didn't have clean cyber in general. So how are you looking at your third parties? Just generally from their security posture. Do you have some objective analysis of them with, like the Black Kites here, you got the BitSight, you got Security Scorecard, all those guys, giving you some insight into what's happening? I know we've talked about the questionnaires and how much value they have, but you got to do it. The reality is when you are using software, you're basically automating some process. And that process, you're basically kind of outsourcing that when you buy that software. You can't transfer the risk to the guys who made the software program. If you've got regulatory requirements, if you've got anything that you're going to be held accountable for, you're still accountable for it. Just because you use somebody else's software doesn't mean you can transfer that risk. We saw with Uber when one of their partners had an issue, it impacted them. Nobody went after their partner, they went after Uber.
Yep.
Uber was the one all over the newspaper. When you are the one that's collecting the data, when you are the one that's delivering the service that people interface with, you're going to be the one that's going to be held accountable when something goes wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. Helen, then let's bring it to you, because in the software development world, it sounds like maturity is key here. And yet we're balancing that off against maybe these startups where it's cheaper, it's niche, it's better. Where do you see the governance? How do you balance sort of that I want this piece of software because it fits in my budget versus I need the maturity of having something as complete as SBOMs and inventories plus the SOC 2s on top of it?
The answer would be very similar from the startup or enterprise organization. The maturity comes from the basic things of securing your DevOps, automating the process of generating SBOMs, securing the inventory, and consuming those SBOMs for transparency. We also have to consider the maturity of infrastructure, of course. Consuming the SBOMs from vendors as a software company, as a vendor company, of course, it's not only the software that we develop we have to secure and we have to have transparency, but also all the components from third-party and infrastructure that we need to have transparency, how we operate the software. And this is something that is very important, and we are talking not just software up to the hardware level components and so on. And that's especially important, I find, as well for IoT, the medical devices, and everything that gets assembled. At the end, all these devices have software, and they have to have already also transparency on what they have, what's included, and what's the risk.
Well, let's jump into that then, because you talked about IoT, medical devices. They all have software components as well, right? And as we build these things out, like who here thinks that IoT is the next thing that crushes us? Just me? Wow. Okay, there's a couple in the back, because I think it will. But how do you make those decisions in building critical infrastructure, like, for instance, planes, where you have to include some of these components? How do you do that? Is there something that you use to build off of hardware versus software? Are they separate in your risk register? Are they dealt with differently? Manis?
Yeah, so this one is a difficult one to answer.
That's why
because
I get to you first.
because we don't control the manufacturers, and manufacturers have held these components very close to their heart because of like this being a safety issue. If
Right.
because like the softwares that are used in the components for an aircraft and how they can be manipulated, the ones that we get to see, let's say on the guest-facing entertainment systems and all, are like totally segregated. So you don't really get into that. Does that mean there is no problem? There is still that problem because the manufacturers are still relying on certain third parties to build certain components. It's just that it has still not become to that extent where it can cause any issues because you don't really cannot really manipulate those softwares to like cause any issues with flight operations. So, like we have, let's say, an approach which is more stringent, which is saving us. At some point, this needs to probably change when the intellectual property excuse may not be acceptable to the regulators anymore, let's say.
Gotcha. And Vaughn, on your side, from CN's perspective, is that sort of the same thing? Is it, is there a way to balance it? Or just keep you up at night?
Can you rephrase that question, please?
So the sort of the use of IoT and SCADA systems, the devices, the hardware that's being put out there, how are you balancing that out in your supply chain risk register?
Yeah. Okay. So you're mixing IoT and OT. So let's talk about OT because that's what we do a lot of. We deal with things that are life safety critical. For example, the positive train control that we're required to have in the United States that applies the brakes automatically if someone exceeds the limit of the speed they're supposed to be going in a particular section of track. Those kinds of things that we have in place. We have basically looked at those individually. We've done network isolation. We've done all this stuff to kind of control